we're going to talk about different people who are going to take money off you and why they're going to do that. Okay? So, well, this is the reality of buying a car. Okay? So, the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to tell you about the three groups of people who you're going to have to pay money to. You might be able to guess what some of them are. Anyone want to give a suggestion? Okay, number one, or the first one you want to put down, I'm going to write the government. I'm going to put that here in the middle. You'll see why in a second. You do have to pay the government a substantial amount of money, but not the biggest amount. Who does the biggest amount of money go to?
The dealer.
Yeah, very, okay, yeah, so the catch-all word for that I'm going to give it is the dealership. Now, I'm going to say dealership and not worry too much about if you were an individual buying off another individual, like my first two cars, which were both bought secondhand off of an individual. So we're going to go with, I'm going to call it a dealership. You might say, for example, because of my bias towards Japanese cars, you might say Kasuhu Toyota. That's a dealership, okay? And you have to pay them the lion's share of the money you're paying for this car. Now, there's one last group that we need to worry about. Okay, insurers, they are the people who are going to take little sums of money off you over a long period of time to insure you, whatever that means. We'll get to that in a second. Okay, yes? That's not cool. Are you okay? Well, maybe, possibly. Can someone give me some examples of names of insurers? Okay, Amy. Who else? NRMA, GIO, Allianz, GI, all this list of people. Okay, so you get the idea.
All those ads.
Yes, they advertise a lot. Okay, so now let's think about what are you actually paying for? Because to each of these groups of people, conveniently, you're basically paying two things to each one, okay? So let's again go through, like what's the biggest sum of money? The actual biggest sum of money. It's the car itself, right? So we would call that the retail price. Okay, so when we say retail price, if you're watching a TV ad and they're like, you know, $29,990, drive away, that's that number, okay? That number there is the actual price of the car. And then you notice there's like a little asterisk next to $29,990. Well, we're going to talk about that. It's actually not little at all. It's a very big asterisk, okay? So, yeah, we'll talk about that. We will talk about that. It's like you can pay for the car, but you can't have it, okay? We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, firstly, there's the price of the car itself. But then they have to, we'll get to that in a minute. The other thing you pay to the dealership is not registration, that'll come in later, but the price of actually getting the car to you. So we call that, generally speaking, dealer delivery. So, for example, one of the cars I almost bought was actually a car in Canberra. So that car's got to get from Canberra to me, and I'm not going to go there to get it, so I have to pay for the delivery, okay? Now, before we move into these other kinds of things we pay for, let's talk about these things and what their purposes are. So firstly, retail price. That's really simple. That's just, well, what's the car worth? What is the value of the car? You buy a bigger car, you buy a newer car. Yeah, absolutely. Very practical, okay? That's what goes into the retail price, okay? Plus a hefty profit margin for, obviously, whichever company is manufacturing it. There's value of the car, but totally separate from that, there is the processing, the paperwork, all that kind of stuff in order to prepare the vehicle. That's what the dealer delivery includes, okay? So I would call that processing. And things like, you know, they're going to put mats in your car. They might have to do a safety check at the beginning before they hand the car over. Because if you like drive out of that dealership with a brand new car and then the wheels all fall off and you get in an accident, guess who's liable, right? Yeah, it actually happens. Okay, so these are the simple costs. Now, I will point out, when we say drive away, usually what that means is both of these things together. That's usually what it's referring to, okay? So it's like, yep. We'll get the car and we'll also give it to you, so that's drive away, okay? However, you can't legally drive away. You can physically drive away, but you can't legally drive away until you've paid a few other things, okay? So let's now talk about the government. People have mentioned registration already. Registration, okay? Now, the registration of a car, we'll talk about its purpose in a minute. It has an informal name. It's often called a pink slip. Does anyone know why it's called a pink slip? Because when you fill out the form, if you don't do it online, there is a pink piece of paper. Okay, so that's why they call it you've got to go for your pink slip. Okay, now we'll talk about what the purpose of that is in a second, but there's one other thing that needs to be paid. Does anyone know what else needs to be paid? It also applies to property and real estate if you buy that. It's a percentage. It's got a strange name. It's called stamp duty. Okay. Now, stamp duty is exactly what it sounds like. You're literally paying for the government to put a stamp on a series of paperwork that's related to your car. I'm going to talk about what they are in a minute.